Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Trustee Handbook Book Club After Party Part 3. This is a pre-recorded session with the Handbook team where we ask and answer the questions we could not get to during the earlier book club sessions. So in this recording, we have questions coming up from the topics of Committee on Open Government, Board Director Relationship, Financial Planning and Budgeting, Strategic Planning, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, Access, and Justice, and Financing and Managing Construction Projects. If you haven't watched these sessions, you can head over to midhudson.org/trustee book club for all the recordings and resources. As always, we have Brian Hildreth and myself who are moderating this discussion, and our library experts and authors of the Trustee Handbook, Rebecca Smith-Aldrich and Jerry Nichols, are here to answer questions today. Hey team, how's everybody doing today?
Doing well, thank you.
All right,
Thank you,
nice.
guys.
So we're going to jump right into it today, and we are going to start with questions on the Committee on Open Government. And the first one that we have was, what does it mean to provide notice for a public meeting, and what are their different responsibilities for different types of libraries? What are the different types of responsibilities for different types of libraries?
So all libraries fall under open meetings law, which is what the Committee on Open Government oversees. So when we take a look at the open meetings law, it's really clear that public libraries fall under open meetings law, but because of education law, association libraries also fall under open meetings law. So all libraries fall under open meetings law. And giving notice of your meetings comes in a couple of different formats. The law is very specific on public notice. So one thing to remember is that there's still analog as well as digital notice to give on your meetings. So think about how you normally publicize events going on at the library through your library calendar, or you have a different spot on your website that you're advertising things. Your board meetings should be advertised there. Public libraries also have to advertise committee meetings. Within 72 hours, there should also be a paper notice, something stuck to the bulletin board or the door of the library. And of course, every year you have to give notice to your newspaper of record. So at your board's organizational meeting, you should be naming your newspaper of record where people can expect news about the library to be sent. And then you'd want to send all of your meeting dates for the year to that newspaper of record. You're not required to do a legal notice. You don't have to pay to have it posted, but you would want to be able to prove that you sent it to your newspaper of record, that you had complied with the law. Timing wise on the notice issue, they'd like to see notice given at least a week in advance of your meetings. In emergency, what they call emergency situations, they're looking for at least 72 hours notice given for your meetings.
Nice, well answered. Thanks, Rebecca.
Sure.
So the next question is, what is considered a record to be discussed at a public meeting, and how do we make it available to comply with open meetings law?
I'm glad this question got asked because the law changed relatively recently. It used to be that you just had to have copies of documents you might be discussing at your board meeting. So if a member of the public were there and wanted to follow along with you, you could pass out that item to them in the audience. The newer amendments to the law now require that you post those documents to your website no later than 24 hours in advance of your meeting. So you do have to put it on your website. I know it's something that a lot of trustees might not be used to, but it's basically that board packet you're getting in advance of your meeting should be posted to the library's website. So anyone who's following along with the meeting has access to those documents. In terms of which documents need to be up there, it's basically anything that's going to be discussed during the meeting so that someone who is listening and following along could actually see what the trustee is seeing and discussing at the same time. That's the intent behind the law, which is kind of helpful to help you categorize which documents need to be posted or not. So if you're going to be discussing your financial reports, which you are, those are going to be part of the packet that's available online. If you're discussing amendments to an existing policy, the amendments to that existing policy are posted online ahead of time. So you'll see very specific language in the law that is related to any rule, regulation, policy, or amendment that you're going to be discussing. Those are the absolutes, but the intent there is any document that's going to be discussed that's not confidential, of course, would be available to the public so they could have it in front of them and follow along with the discussion.
For ours, I like to put our link to our board packet right on the calendar page that we have right on our calendar so people can see here's when the meeting is. Oh, and here's all the documents that we're going to be under discussion too. Which works out pretty well. Great. Thanks, Rebecca.
I always
I'm
find that.
sorry, one more thing I just thought of that goes back to the first question about notice. There are specific rules if you're using video conferencing. So I think that speaks to Ron's point as well, like to assume if you're doing video conferencing, your notice must say you are doing video conferencing and where people can attend at your video conferencing locations or the link to the online meeting. But again, it doubled down on that idea that these need to be electronically available, not just passed out at a meeting.
Brian, did you have a point you wanted to
Oh,
make too?
yeah, I was just going to go back to Ron's point in terms of like efficiency. So placing that board packet and anything that's part of that record online, it's helpful for after the fact as well. So not only, being transparent with your community members and providing that information going into the meeting, so they're just as well, versed in what's going to be talked about as the trustees are. As administrators, there's a huge level of efficiency there too, where you might have community members that like to follow up on that information. And instead of, having to like fumble and try to pull all that information together from internal files or wherever you're storing them within the library, just get them up there on the website, be as transparent as possible. And, so when that community member does ask for that, just take that link from the website and email it to them or, reference it for them, and it's quickly available to them.
Nice. So one thing that happens in public meetings on a fairly regular basis for different types of government entities is that the public comes to meetings, and in some regard there's a public comment situation in a lot of meetings where people are able to say something. But the question that came in is, what are strategies for handling public comment when the board does not wish to respond to questions?
That's a reasonable question. I think it's important that everyone be clear that open meetings law allows for the public to attend the meeting, but it does not give them the right to speak during the meeting. The meeting is for conducting the business of the library. And really, if we think about it, it's as a courtesy, there's a public comment period perhaps added to your board's agenda. Some boards put it at the beginning, some at the end, some do it at the beginning and end. But regardless of how you are positioning that in the agenda, you should have adopted rules for how you manage your public comment period. And you'll notice now on the Division of Library Development's website under how to meet minimum standards, they're actually now requiring you to have rules related to public comment periods. And that's because they can get really out of hand if you don't have a plan for how to manage them. So number one, you should have written rules for your public comment period. All people that are coming in should be treated equally. If you're going to let people talk, they all have to be given that same right, and there can be rules around that. The board president is the facilitator in those moments, and there should be a little bit of training or orientation for the full board of how to behave during public comment period. Sometimes folks can lob comments at you or make accusations that can really get your ire up, and you might want to really defend yourself or defend the library, and that's not always the best thing to do in that moment. So trusting the board president to facilitate that moment, and also to give yourselves the license to not respond in the moment, because you might not have all the information related to the issue the member of the public is worked up about. So I think being politically correct in those moments is being respectful to folks as they're making their comments, answering information that is requested through the board president, and recognizing that sometimes it's okay to say thank you for your comments, we'll take it under advisement, and following up with that person afterwards. So I think there's always that kind of pressure, right? When you're in front of the public, we always preach transparency, be accountable. We're accountable to our public, but we have to recognize that there's some behavior in these times that folks are showing up in public comment periods that they are trying to hijack the meeting or use it as their platform for their issue. And that's not the right venue for that. And so the board president's job is to enforce that in that moment during public comment. So written rules for how to treat folks, a little bit of training and orientation for trustees that it's okay that we're not going to answer every question that might come up in that venue, but feeling confident that you will get back to that person with information if it's warranted.
I'd like to resonate what Rebecca just said. Do not get into a conversation. Do not get into an argument, of course. And I counsel boards a little more simply than that. I say you have only two responses. Thank you for your comment. Or we'll look into it and the director will get back to you. Do not start a dialogue, because then their time limit just got blown away. And you can be back and forth on and on and on. So please hold your temper and keep a smile and say, we'll get back to you. Thank you. They're trying to bait you sometimes, so be careful.
Yeah, and I would say that there's a lot of case studies right now in New York State, for libraries that have had to experience those types of challenges to library services and deal with those tough conversations with their community members. And that public comment policy is like an absolute solid go-to. Take a look at it, make sure that it's, vetted properly, either through legal counsel or through your library system. Library systems have great resources for that, but it's really solid ground for how you handle those situations. And it's what that public comment policy for, a lot of what Rebecca and Jerry just talked about, is just the fact that you're putting it together in a time when emotions aren't running high, emotions off the table, and you're just putting the rules of the game together in that moment. And then when you have that policy in place and you get into those situations where those emotions are running high with some members in your community, it is a great playbook for really how to implement those situations well. And again, reach out to your library system directors too. I'm sure they could provide you some really great links of situations where that's played out and the library had a really good public comment policy in place and the library board really handled those situations really well. So I think that's going to bring us up to our next question. It's still under open meetings law, but we're moving a little bit away from the public meeting realm, but we are moving into subcommittee meetings. So are subcommittees required to fulfill the requirements of OML like the full board?
There's multiple advisory opinions from the Committee on Open Government on this topic specific to libraries. And the way it shakes out is that for public libraries, the board committees are falling under open meetings law. They have to follow the notice path and posting of documents, and the meetings are open in an accessible location anytime 2 or more members of the board are together to do the business of the library. So public libraries, so municipal, school district public libraries, special district public libraries, you fall under open meetings law for your committees. Association libraries, it has been ruled, do not. Their committees do not fall under that unless they're serving a population of over 1 million people, which is a small number of libraries in New York State. So I think by the letter of the law, association library, your committees technically do not fall under open meetings law. But there's always that, I think, old chestnut we go back to again and again here at the Trustee Handbook Book Club, is that why wouldn't you be transparent with your committee work? You are receiving an enormous amount of public money in most cases. The idea is that folks can come and watch the business of their library being done to understand how decisions are being made. So I would say that you might want to err on the side of transparency and posting the fact that those committees are meeting. But by the letter of the law, no, association committees are not falling under open meetings law for the most part.
Great. We have one more question about open meetings law, and this one comes up. I hear it somewhat often, mainly because boards and directors are trying to reconcile the idea of how they interact with open meetings law and how other organizations may need to interact with open meetings law. So the question that comes up are other nonprofits like library friends groups required to follow open meetings law?
So while at the face of this, it seems very cut and dry, but we have to qualify this one because we have to ask the question, is your friends group separately incorporated or not? If your friends group is a separate 501c3, so a separate legal entity, they do not fall under open meetings law. They fall under the Not-for-Profit Revitalization Act, which has procedures that govern the meetings of a nonprofit corporation in New York State. If your friends group is what might be called an ad hoc group, or really essentially acting legally as a committee of the library board, yeah, I would say you'd want to err on the friends groups falling under open meetings law, because technically the legal umbrella organization is the library. So I think that's going to be a wake-up call to a lot of friends groups to think about the fact that their meetings should be open to the public, which might actually help with recruitment. You never know. Running a great friends meeting and showing how much fun it is to do good work for the library could be a great way to have more people join the work and what you're doing. But I think it's really important to carefully define the legal status of your friends group to answer this question. There's, I think, a gray area that a lot of folks feel like unincorporated friends groups fall into, but we have to respect the fact that the library is the ultimate governance authority over a group that's not separately legally incorporated, which is not always a popular thing for a friends group to hear, but it's important for the library to understand that there's money involved, right? Money is coming into a friends group to be used on behalf of the library and to promote its services. And so I think there's some level of accountability when it comes to an unincorporated friends group being transparent in how their meetings are held.
So we heard Rebecca mention the word recruitment, and that's a good segue for our next question. So what are some suggestions for succession planning for directors or trustees?
Well, I think we've all got a little take on this one. But first of all, part of the director's job should be succession planning, which means training staff from within, and making sure that they have some ideas and a process for the board to fill the vacancy when they leave. All too often, the directors don't want to do this because honestly, some of them feel a little bit threatened. I happen to have been in an area where the use of an assistant director is almost required. Everyone does it. The assistant directors are also are nurtured and quite often sent off to another library to get a little more seasoning as a director, and sometimes they even come back. But so the first requirement is the director has a responsibility to the organization, and the board should remind the director of that during their annual evaluation and ask them how it's going. And even if you have a young director, relatively new director, it's never too early to start growing succession plans. As to trustees, again, if you're a public library and you're having public votes, sometimes you don't really control who the next trustee is. But I know one of the favorite approaches is looking at your friends group to see if you have certain active people that have shown leadership there. If you have been engaged in a major project, or say your strategic planning, and you involve members of the community, those are folks that have already shown interest in the library and may well have the best interest of the library in their hearts, and I think it's something that you would cultivate them and invite them to board meetings and whatnot. As public, when you have a public vote, of course, anyone can just run, that's a resident and whatnot. But I think what you're trying to do is encourage those people that care about the library to show an interest in the library, because one of these days you just might get a special interest group that wants to get into censor books, which has happened recently in some of our libraries. So I think it's something that you should spend some time on. Association libraries, of course, those that are self-perpetuating get to choose their trustees. And this actually rolls into the next question. I'm going to jump ahead. It says we have a long-serving trustee, and I'm assuming that's from an association library. But quickly, if it's a public library and you have a public library, municipal, special district, school district, there are no term limitations. However, association libraries, I'm speaking from a personal opinion, a professional one, term limits are very useful. There are many libraries in this state that have trustees serving 35, 40 years, and that's wonderful. But it's time to move over and give someone else a chance in this person's opinion. I'm sure you guys have other suggestions to add to this.
I would share on the association side. I have a very strong association library in my system. And one of the things I love that they do is on their website, they make it very clear how to run for the board. So it's not mysterious. And I think that's part of our problem is we assume everyone understands how you might get on the board, but it is mysterious to most people. They think it's a little insiders club. So transparent information on the library's website about the board, how people get on the board, what the cycle looks like of nomination or appointment, and if there's term limits or not, what to expect in that arena. And then they also have like an application process. So someone can put forth their vision of what it would be like to serve on the board. They're invited to come to an orientation session to really learn more about being on the library board. They encourage their potential candidates to come to training at the system. So I have folks coming to my Trustee Essentials workshop we do here in Mid-Hudson, and they're people who are considering getting on the board. And so far, they've all decided to get on the board. So I'm taking that as a win from our curriculum side of how we do things. But there's a cultivation pathway that's being created there. So folks can see themselves in that role, learn more about that role, and make an educated decision about getting onto that board. And even though the public library setting, sometimes people feel like I can't influence that. You can actually.
Sure you can.
You can have information on your website about what it
Yeah.
means to serve on the board and welcome people to come and watch you and consider and ask questions about being on the board. And as Jerry said, when you see someone who might be a good candidate, encouraging them, empower them, help them see the pathway forward.
I still find when I do trustee workshops in person and then, on Zoom, I'll ask the trustees, why are they a trustee? And about half of them will say, well, because a current trustee asked me. They said, oh, it's no work.
Yep.
Don't worry, just do a meeting once a month. By the way, Rebecca, great point about advertising and putting information on websites. I've seen that a couple of times. And I'd also note that almost all of them link to the trustee handbook, so you can get a good idea of what to expect. So but I think, and I do concur, one of the most successful libraries I have ever worked with, an association library, has a term limit, 3 years. And every year they have a potluck supper for all former trustees just before their public vote. So they have like 50 former trustees that they know they and their family are going to vote for that library budget every single year. So, but that's their culture, and it's a very positive one. So.
And Rebecca, I love what you're saying about you're kind of cultivating your board at that point too, making sure people understand the expectations of being on a board and really finding people who are passionate and interested in making sure that the library becomes like such a great community resource. And it's not an afterthought like, oh, I'm on the library board. It's like, I'm on the library board because it is such a great community asset and resource.
And I'll say, to build on Jerry's comment about term limits and why they're healthy, not only getting new blood into the organization, but I just recently helped a library who did not have term limits for a long time, and we decided to institute them there. A very good board, excellent board. They raised millions of dollars to build a new building. They did a fabulous job. They were all tired and maybe looking for a way out. And maybe that was part of the reason we were doing the term limits. But the other thing I saw was the change in culture and urgency. Once people realized there's an arc to my storyline on the board, right? I might just be getting started, or as I'm finishing, what do I want my legacy to be as a board member? And I saw the pace pickup of work. So I think sometimes when there's that open-ended, I could be here forever, is there much urgency about what work you'll get done while you're on that board? Where if you can see, like, my time here is going to sunset. I want to make sure I got that policy done that I promised I would get done. I want to make sure that building project gets done that I promised was going to happen while I was on this board. It changes the energy a little bit too, I found, with some boards.
I like how Rebecca's bringing up that idea of promises, and this goes back to, we started talking about succession planning for directors, and I agree with Jerry. Like it is a responsibility of the director to make sure that the organization continues to grow beyond the time of when the director leaves, and so every good director is thinking about that, whether they're retiring or they're going to be moving on to a different library. What does that look like? Because the success of the library is just not happening when the director is there. It's like, what's the success of that library after the director leaves? And so particularly if we want to scale things down, not all libraries in New York State are going to have, the budgets that support assistant directors or many people working in administration. So if we scale it down towards like rural libraries, I think it comes down to training, like just making sure. So if you do have paid staff or you have volunteers and you're the only paid staff person as a director, just having a good radar as to like who's working in the library, who's committed to the mission, who has the knowledge, skills, and abilities to do this work when you leave as a director. And while you want your board to advertise for that position and try to get as many wide variety of skill sets and diverse candidates, knowing that you've got somebody already in the library that can kind of take the baton and run with it potentially, at least in an interim basis, is really important.
I'd like to add one more thing to that. As a retired system director, knowing that I have 3 colleagues here on the screen who do this, you should ask your system to make sure that they provide training for potential directors or just basic supervisory training. It's not expensive. It's easily done. And there are some marvelous models around the state. And I know my colleagues here could probably tell you where to look. But I think it's something that if you don't think your library can do it, well, that's why you have a system. And systems, one of their primary purposes should be training. And if they're not, then I would challenge my system director to come through for me. That's all. Enough said.
We love challenges. That's good, Jerry.
Yeah.
So moving away from board trustee terms and appointments and topics like that, this one is more about staff in the library. So is the board approving staff appointments just a rubber stamp since the director is tasked with hiring? When would there ever be a situation where the board would disagree with that type of appointment?
Okay. I'll start real quick with this one. The trustee handbook has for many years said the director selects, the board appoints. And that's the process. And we believe in that. And one of the biggest issues we run into is boards wanting to micromanage that process and leave the governance role and move into management. That said, it really boils down to some trust. You trust your director to select the proper people. If you don't trust your director to select the proper people, then you have another problem on your hands. Usually we would recommend that for most minor appointments, I say minor, clerical below, unless maybe that you trust your director. They've gone through the process, be it civil service or just advertising and whatnot, and you would go along with their recommendation. Once you get to higher level, like I mentioned, assistant directors or people or business manager or in larger institutions, that it's appropriate for the director to inform you of the credentials of the people that they're recommending. And for someone like an assistant director, especially if you're thinking about possible succession, maybe a chance to meet the person. The board has every right to not appoint. Yes, it can be awkward, but that's your job. And I think that if you don't feel comfortable with the process or the selection, you need to ask your director to do a little more homework to convince you, and then work it from there. That's the best way I could put it. I'm sure my colleagues have another take on it, but exercise your authority. That's all.
I think that when you exercise that authority, though, you better be really justified. You better have a really solid reason. Let's say you found a news article about that person that they were involved in potential fraud in another organization. Like, you better have a solid reason to interfere with that process and put a halt to it.
Yeah.
Not just like, I don't know, I don't really like that person, or
No.
you better
Yeah.
be real clear about why you're going to interfere with that process, because I think there's only a few instances in which that would probably be justified.
Right. Agreed.
All right, so we'll move on to the next question. We're still talking about board director relationships in some capacity, but is the Office of the State Comptroller still auditing libraries?
Yeah, they absolutely are. They haven't been doing it as frequent as we saw a few years ago. There was rumors swirling around that there was a lot of staff at the OSC that didn't know what to do. So they said, oh, we'll just audit every single public library in the state. And so that slowed down a little bit. So now we're seeing audits of libraries that are being triggered by specific complaints for the most part. But we have seen a new trend also of the state comptroller auditing organizations, including libraries, for whether or not they're in compliance with the sexual harassment prevention training law. So that's a new area of audit that we're now seeing come out. So those spot checks of, have you done this? So to that question of, is anyone ever going to check our work? The answer is yes. So yeah, I think it's one of those things you never quite know when it's going to happen. And it can be accelerated by someone reporting some confusion about something going on at the library or displeasure with something going on at the library. So definitely still happening.
Nice. Thanks, Rebecca. How should the library balance asking for more money and possibly exceeding the tax cap and paying a competitive wage to our director?
I'm going to defer to you guys on this one. It's a pretty standard question, but
I'm happy to start with this one. You know, in the handbook, and I think as you learn about the role of a library trustee, part of the job is to make sure you've secured adequate funding to run that library. So if you agree that libraries are essential and we must provide quality service to meet the needs of our communities because of the essential nature of what we do, part of that is actually correcting past wrongs. You may have inherited a library with a budget that's been chronically underfunded. You might have inherited a library where no one took a look or advocated for salaries and benefits for a long time. So part of your job is risk management and thinking about the salary and benefits issue. A lot of people get tied up in their personal feelings about that, but you have to elevate your thinking to understand your job is to stabilize that library and minimize the risk of high turnover, which is extremely expensive and interrupts the development of quality service to the community. So investment in the staff is part of the stabilization work and the sustainability work necessary to create a great library that's going to be around for a long time to serve your community. So I think doing anything around salaries and benefits, it's delicate to talk about that with your community when going for an increase with a public vote. But I think well-informed talking points are key. So doing the homework, let's compare salaries to not only other libraries in this county or region, but also with other nonprofit leadership and education leadership. When you take a look at the scope of responsibilities of the library director, and then you look at the salaries perhaps of other nonprofit leaders in the region, are you competitive? Because the skill set those directors have is transferable. And since COVID, we're seeing more directors of libraries willing to make the jump out of the profession into other industries to get that better salary and benefits package. So to remain competitive and to have the retention levels necessary to grow your library, it's really a no-brainer that you have to take a closer look at those numbers. And when warranted, go above the tax cap with a well-reasoned, justified case for why you're doing so.
Just to jump in here, I'll use a couple sound bites. Rebecca and I did the budgeting workshop back in 2023. And like my first response to this question is service-based budgeting. Like go through each individual line item and really try to recognize like what it truly costs to operate your library in 2024, taking into account the needs of your community and your plan of service or the strategic plan that you recently put together. It's tough. It's really tough. And so, going through that exercise is really important. And when you go through that exercise as a board in partnership with your bookkeeper and your treasurer and your financial officer and your director, you really realize the true cost of offering really great public library services. And you'll see that you're probably underfunded in some ways or a lot of ways. Doing benchmarks also is extremely important. Rebecca mentioned that, what's the library up the street that has a very similar community taking in to operate that library, and are they doing good work? And if they are, and their funding levels are far higher than where you're at, then maybe you need to do that financial work. The other term or key word that I'd like to use is just libraries are 1%, in most cases, 1% of local property taxes. And so the amount of funding that our communities are investing in our libraries is far more below than what they're investing in other government entities. And so, what does it look like when we double down and let's say we become 2% of local property taxes or 3% of local property taxes? We're all taxpayers in New York State. We recognize what that cost is, but we're not, libraries aren't part of the tax burden in New York State. So like recognizing that you have to fund libraries and you have to ask for that funding is really important. And then the last thing I'll probably end on is have you tried to hire recently? Because it is really tough. It's really tough. And so you need to make sure, going back to that idea of doing benchmarks, I mean, Rebecca said it, like we're not only just talking about trying to find the best for libraries, we're worried about losing really good librarians to other industries and fields because we can't keep up with the times. And that's a really concerning thing for the future of librarianship in our greater New York State library community. So I appreciate the question. I love it. And I hope this board and all boards are addressing it.
And echoing back to the workshop Brian and I did on budget planning, sometimes you can't fix it all in one go. Sometimes you have to do the work, do the homework, recognize where you should be, and sometimes create a multi-year financial plan to say, okay, we're going to go above the tax cap, but only by, a 0.5% this year, but we're going to do that consistently for 3 years to get to where we need to be in order to have a healthier organization.
All right. Ron, I think I got next question. Thumbs up if I do. Okay. So my impression is the president may end up doing a lot of communication tasks. What are boundaries for the president when communicating between the directors, board, and staff?
I'll start. First of all, the board president's primary function is to preside at board meetings. The second important function is to act as a liaison between the board, the will of the board, and the director, and keep the rest of the board informed of what's going on. What I do want to hesitate on when it said director, board, and staff, I think trustees need to be very cautious about too much interaction with staff. Your governance body, you should not be talking directly with staff or inviting their comments about, oh, how's she doing? You know, if you want to ask how their kids are, that's fine. But that's not something that's comfortable that you should engage in, because it undermines the chain of command. That said, there's one other group that should be on that list, and that's community. Now, the board president should be, along with the director, and you got to work out your protocol, the spokesperson for the library, especially during major projects or times of challenge and trial and whatnot. There is a communication function there. You should have the sound bites ready for you when the newspaper calls and said, hey, I heard, or what's this about a new building? Or you're going to break the tax cap this year? You're going to pay that director all that money? So I think you need to be prepared to that, and your director should help you with those sound bites. But again, yes, that's your job, is to communicate, preside and communicate, and keep the information and the trust and transparency flowing throughout the organization and throughout the community.
Think sometimes it gets confusing with the operation of the board, right? Like getting the board packet out or communicating about a meeting change or some procedural issues. So I think the director and board president have to be a good team, and making it really clear who's going to take the lead on some of the more clerical stuff. Because if you have both parties trying to help with that, it can get confusing for the team. So I think strong relationship, board president and director, is important, and that it's really clear who's going to take the lead where in communicating with the board. But I absolutely agree with Jerry. I think the times in which the board president is speaking to the staff are actually very limited. You might see it during times of transition or crisis, that the voice of the board needs to be directly heard by the staff.
And I think when we're talking about external communication too, referring back to our public communications policy is always important. But we know that one of the responsibilities of trustees is to either advocate or talk about the library to the community. But going back to that public communications policy, when Rebecca says, like, in times of crisis, and questions are being asked of the library by, let's say, members of the media, really you have two people that should be communicating. And Jerry said that it should be the director and potentially the board president. But having a good public communications policy in place, similar to having a good public comment policy in place, it provides the procedural steps for, like, who speaks, when they speak, and how or why they speak. And so taking a look at that policy is also helpful to this question.
This next question we have coming up, this one may be a lot to do with local practice and how they're handling things at their library, but I would love to get some opinions on this one. Should staff other than the director attend monthly board meetings? What are your thoughts?
Yes. And it's a good practice and a pretty common practice where department heads, or however you designate them, people will come and be given a role to tell the board about a program that they're running, or how's the children's, what do we do in the reference department? What do we do in this department? Inform the board, give your staff an opportunity to participate, to speak up, to get that practice, and maybe it's actually succession planning in action. But absolutely, and of course, any staff can come to any board meeting because the boards are open meetings. So that's not really an issue for a lot of libraries, because they have frequent visitors, sometimes from the staff, and sometimes they're not even happy and they want to bring something to the board's attention. But absolutely, I think that's important.
All right, next question. Should a library board consider grants or funding models other than tax funds to fund special projects?
I'll start with that one. I think it depends on the special project. Are we talking about something that is related to mission critical activities of the library? Because that's something that we can't leave to chance or maybe have the time to do a fundraising campaign for. I think we would need to be very clear that libraries are, as Jerry's famous line is, that we're not charities. We're part of the education infrastructure of our communities. We can't leave stuff to chance. But every once in a while in your planning process, you might come across things that would be nice, but aren't mission critical. And those are great things to prioritize for fundraising and grant writing. But I would say if it's a facility project, use the mechanisms in place for you to either use public bonding, state grants for those that are available to your public library, and don't leave them the chance through fundraising. I think fundraising really should be left for the things, again, that would be nice, but aren't mission critical, because the time you'll spend as a board fundraising can sometimes outstrip the governance work that you're supposed to be doing, that you're charged with doing. So getting distracted by the fun fundraising event over here, in my experience, what it means is we're all of a sudden not doing the policy work. We're not doing the sustainable funding work. We're not working to build our base to pass our budget votes. We're distracted by raising $5,000 for this project that honestly should have been folded into the regular budget.
All right, we have another financial planning and budgeting question on this one. This one gets pretty money heavy. How do we determine the per capita, which is like the cost per thousand, and other measurements to talk about library funding?
I wanted to ask Brian to help with this one, because you've done such excellent work in Southern Tier to help libraries with this one.
Yeah, I think it depends on like what measurements you're looking for and who's the reader of that information. We work with our member libraries to help them understand like what their financial position is, and then looking at those numbers in terms of like funding per capita, as well as just like what the tax impact is. So if you're talking about tax impacts, it depends on how your library is funded. But most libraries can find, you know, so if a library is funded through a school district 259 or a 414 referendum through the municipality, work with that municipality or that school district to determine what the actual tax rate is. And then they can help you determine what that cost is per thousand, or a home assessed at, let's say, $100,000. Another source of that, if you're a little bit shy in asking those entities, which you shouldn't, they're your partner, would be just looking at your county's website. So real property tax services, every county government has those services available to you. And so reaching out to your county government so that they can find that information for you, because they have to track all of it. They can find that information for you. And then going back to the question about like funding per capita, and if there's a specific level that public library should be funded at, I think this depends. I know that the state library and the Division of Library Development back in the early 2000s put out a number, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jerry or Rebecca, but I think that number was like $20 per capita or something like that. That's always scalable to the region that you're in. We've learned that somewhere between $16 to $20 in our region, which is very mostly rural, that's the benchmark for where libraries start doing really objective good work, like Rebecca says, mission critical type work, and you know, they're performing well and they're engaged with their community. And when they fall below that $16 per capita number, then objectively they're missing the mark sometimes. But you know, we're always shooting above that $20 threshold. So those are just some of the things that we're looking at when we're talking about those funding measurements. And I'm sure, Rebecca, you got a lot more to add to that one.
Just quickly, Brian. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Drew.
The study you were discussing was commissioned by the Regions Commission back in 2000. And you're absolutely correct. I'm not going to throw numbers out because that was 20-something years ago. But there is a critical per capita amount varying region by region that makes a difference between a library that is just subsisting and a library that is thriving. And it's really a number. It's funny what a difference it makes. And I think that's something, if you can determine what's appropriate, and Brian has for his region, it's something that can really help give you an understanding of not what you want to ask. If you want to have a good library, you have to have money behind it. And if you're afraid to ask the community, then go volunteer someplace else and let someone else get on the board who's got the courage to stand up for their institution.
Yeah, we don't use that per capita number anymore. It was, as Jerry said, over 20 years old, not adjusted for inflation, not recognizing the regional differences across New York State and the different costs of livings that we deal with downstate compared to upstate. So I think, you know, the better marker is benchmarking against other libraries in the region. So maybe system-wide or county-wide, that help us understand what it looks like, right? Because I think part of the problem is these numbers are out of context. right? What it takes to run a library in one community versus another has a number of variables related to it. One library might be also managing a historic building that is way more expensive to maintain than this library over here that's in a building that's 8 years old. There might be other variables related to cost of living, where one town has really strong economy, another one lost its major industry, and therefore there's no local tax base, right? There's a lot of variables. So always look at numbers in context and make sure you're not judging yourself against something that's over 20 years old.
Yeah, there's a lot of system, only speaking from personal experience. Annually, the system would break down per capita support. It would break down actually also by assessed valuation, by all kinds of circulation statistics and whatnot, but not just countywide. It would do it by what we'd call, and we had towns within that were pretty similar. And so you had your neighbors to compare to, as well as the people that were 40 miles or 50 miles away. So the data is there, but sometimes you need a little help getting to it. So you need somebody like Brian to do it for you.
All right, we're still talking about financial planning and budgeting. So can the library shift funds from one budget line to another mid-year? And then a follow-up is, what if an unexpected expense comes up? Can we move funds from our reserve funds with a board motion?
Real quick, the answer is yes, if you have the policies in place, right? So your board should have 2 sets of policies here under your financial responsibilities, one of which is going to include a policy about budget amendments. It will make it clear when money can be moved between lines, when the director can just make it happen, or when the director needs to come to the board for board approval to make that move, if it's above a certain percentage perhaps of that line. So make sure you've got that financial control policy for budget amendments. And then the reserve issues, which I know we went on and on about during multiple workshops throughout the series. You must have reserve fund policies that define your reserve funds, the reasons why they are created, and how money gets taken out of them for what purposes. So an unexpected expense, obviously we've got to figure out how to pay for it. Which of the reserve funds were set up to cover that unexpected expense? Was it related to capital issue? Was it related to a programmatic or insurance issue perhaps? So making sure your funds are well defined so that when something unexpected happens, you've got a clear match of where the money will come from and how the board moves the money to prepare for that unexpected item that came up.
Well answered. I like it. Now we're going to move into my personal favorite topic that we're talking about. And I had a lot of fun talking about strategic planning with Rebecca in the earlier trustee handbook session. So if your library is looking at moving towards a new strategic planning process, or you're just looking for general information on it, I recommend taking a look at that recording because it was a lot of fun. But the question that came in is, who is initiating and leading the strategic plan? And if Rebecca or Jerry, if you want to take the lead on that, I'll jump in with some of my own thoughts too.
Why don't you
I
start,
think you
Ron?
should take the lead on that one.
All right, fair enough. So when I look at this question, so who is initiating and leading the strategic plan? I look at it kind of 2 different ways. One, if you're developing a plan, and 2, if you already have a plan and you're looking at who's leading those individual projects within the plan. So when you're starting off a planning process, let's say you're in the expiration year of your old plan, so you're looking to put a new one. So the initiation on that one, it's really going to be a relationship between the board and the director, because the reason that I love planning so much is it allows an opportunity for the trustees and the director to both think, what type of library do we want to have? And this goes back to a lot of the other questions that we've been talking about today too. When you think about funding, when you think about programs, when you think about staffing, all of this stuff is kind of related. So when you think about leading a plan, you really want the board and the director to be involved in a really intimate way, where they are thinking about the future of the organization. When you think about having a plan and you're implementing it, from month to month or project to project or however it is, usually you're going to have the director kind of overseeing your strategic plan, and throughout it, you may have different people or committees or groups who are in charge of specific projects. And then the director is going to kind of keep an overview to make sure things are happening. And then you're reporting out to the full board so everybody can see how your strategic plan is progressing throughout its timeline. And the biggest thing is you want to make sure that your strategic plan and your other essential documents like your budget are really tied together, because if you have something that you're looking at as a strategic initiative, you want to make sure that you have the money that's doing it. And in order to keep everything together, you really need to have that director as well as the board kind of looking at it. So that's kind of my general. So Rebecca and Jerry, if you want to jump in with other things, go ahead on that one.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think the buy-in at the beginning is key. You can't superimpose a planning process on a board. We all have to agree it's time to do this because it's real work, and it infuses or embeds itself throughout almost every committee's experience on the board as it's developed and once it's in place. So I think buy-in at the beginning is super important, and that takes the director and board president working together, or the head of the planning committee working together to make the case for it, to lay out a process, and to build that buy-in.
Excellent. Thanks, guys. When starting a plan during the board visioning phase, should the full board be involved or only a select few? Who gets to do it?
So Rebecca had mentioned earlier of a planning committee, and I think that's really important to have, like, do the actual like work through making sure that you're gathering the information for everybody. But when you're talking about board visioning and you're really looking at what does the future of this organization look like, the full board should be involved in that conversation at some point. Again, it can be something where you have an exercise where everybody kind of puts out their ideas and you come to an ideal consensus of what it looks like. But as Rebecca said, you can't superimpose the process on people after the fact. So that initial buy-in piece where everybody's looking at this as we get to design what we want to do over the next few years to make an incredible organization, having the entire board involved in that initial phase is truly important and very critical to the success of not only getting a plan, but also that final implementation of your plan as you work through the process.
Hey, Ron, if Rebecca and Jerry don't have anything to add, I'm going to ask this next question because we just want to hear you keep talking.
Oh, sure. Let's go for it.
So how often should boards be reviewing the strategic plan? Is it monthly, twice a year, annually?
So I really, if you can't tell, I really like planning. I like projects laying out. So in my view of it, keeping a strategic plan up to date and watching how it's impacting the library as a whole is a really important practice. Now, in some cases, I've seen elements of the strategic plan being reported out in like a director's report at a meeting, and that's okay. And then in others, the strategic plan is pulled out at every single meeting where people are kind of looking at, okay, here's the direction that we're heading in, here's what we're thinking about, just to make sure that it's happening. What I like to do is about every other month, I have the plan in our board packet with some updates on some projects, just so it keeps everybody aware that we are moving forward in this. And I think whatever works locally is great. What you want to avoid is putting a ton of work into developing this wonderful plan and then putting it in a filing cabinet and ignoring it until the plan expires. You really want to make sure that this is an integrated process in how you are making sure the library is becoming the library that you want it to be. So keeping an eye on your strategic plan on a regular scheduled basis is a really good idea.
Anybody else have any thoughts?
I just want to second on Ron's point about the director structuring their report using the strategic plan to keep it in front of people and remind folks progress is being made. So it's not just at the end of the year when we do a report on how it went, but that all along the way, we've got those check-in points to remind folks and also to allow the opportunity to course correct sometimes. Sometimes we put a plan in place, and then as we start working the plan, we realize, oh, that's not quite where it needs to be, or we're off a little bit in our estimation of the importance of that goal. it allows the director the chance to come to the board to ask for course correction. So mid-year, we always recommend that there's a planned discussion with the board of how things are going to allow for course correction.
I would also add that if you have integrated your strategic plan with the annual evaluation process of the director and the goal setting that you're going to evaluate your director on, that some of those goals need to be basically the agenda every month. How are we doing? Or how aren't we doing? And I think that keeps the whole process, it has to be woven together. And I think that it keeps the cycle going, especially when something doesn't work and it fails. You want, okay, fast failures are good. Let's move on. And at least the board knows what's going on, even if it's not good news. But I think that the evaluation, that whole process and goal setting is your strategic plan.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point, Jerry. Like, if you may have things that are included in your strategic plan that might not work out ultimately, and again, that's okay. Just make sure that you're tracking it, find out why it didn't work out. And you can do that while you're reporting it out. And not all news is good, but at least you have something. And learning that one thing didn't work out opens the doors for what's another initiative that we can put into place to effectively work with our community or partners or anything else with what makes a library a library.
And I think Ron brings up a really good point there too, is just the fact that plans can be aspirational, and it's okay that, like, if we don't always meet those aspirations just based on reality, but like the last thing you want to do is develop a plan on the things you were going to do anyways. So like, put those things in there that are high level, that you really are like setting the bar for what expectations are for the organization. And, that will have like a ripple effect in terms of how it impacts culture and mission, and, gets everybody on the same page trying to work towards the same thing. So we've got one more question for strategic planning. So what's the right time frame for a strategic plan? 3 years, 5, 10? Should libraries have short, medium, or long-term plans?
I think this is a really good question, and I don't think there's like one. I don't think there's one right answer. I think there's kind of a situation on when you look at planning on how the best way to implement it is. And I think it being, if you're looking at a strategic plan with specific objectives in it, it's hard to plan that out long term and think like, all right, this is in 2030, here's going to be a project that we're going to work on. I think it makes it a lot easier to say, here are objectives that we're going to accomplish over the next few years. Here, like Brian said, are the aspirations that we want to reach in 5 years. And this is our vision of where we want to, of what we want to achieve in 10 years. So looking at it as, it's nice to have this kind of broad like outlook in what direction the library is heading in, and then having those really specific projects that support that ultimate vision on a cycle that's manageable, where what resources you're going to have, who you're going to have that's going to be working on it, and you can have realistic timelines where you can get it done. So that's kind of how I look at the timeline. And I like to see libraries that they have that kind of broken out. This is the direction we're heading. Here are the projects that we're going to do over the next 2 or 3 years that is going to help us get to that point. And then reassessing that when you do your next plan, because sometimes things change. And I think the past few years, if it's taught us anything, is that things can drastically change over time. So making sure that you are strategic in your decisions and having an opportunity to say, here's how we're going to shift this to still achieve a vision, or maybe we're going to slightly amend our vision to make sure that the projects that we're doing will align with what we're trying to do.
When I started in this work over 25 years ago, I feel like I used to see 10 and 20-year plans from libraries. And now when I think back on that, I'm like, wow, those people were special, because I couldn't imagine 10 years ago what's been going on now in our communities and our libraries. So I'll just report from the field that what I've been seeing more frequently are usually around the 3 to 5 year planning cycles. And in my own organization, the state mandates systems to have 5-year plans. I'm finding that too long. In terms of me feeling like I'm midway through my 5-year plan and I'm going back to my members to get fresh data, because I'm not comfortable that the situation hasn't changed and it needs to be fine-tuned. So I think also getting that rhythm of the data, the movement of your community, how things are changing over time for folks. There's some things that are perennial, but other things, how technology is impacting people's lives. If there's been a big economic downturn in your particular town, those things require a shift in thinking when it comes to strategy.
Nice. Thanks, everybody. That was our little planning stint. Like I said, I love talking about planning, and I love talking to you three about planning too, because I always learn something from you. This next section we're going to move into our equity, diversity, inclusion, access, and justice. This question is, should a board have our other community members, teens, or parents serve on committees, but not formal trustees in order to get a broader perspective? What are your thoughts on that one?
I think sometimes is the answer to that. I think we want to make sure that trustees are not abdicating their authority and their responsibilities on committee work. They've, in many cases, been elected to represent the community. But recognizing where you might be weak in terms of, we don't have representation from a certain demographic or geographic area of the community. Having folks come in to basically be advisors to a board committee, I find appropriate. I don't love when folks are appointed, though, to those committees, because I think it skews the power structure of the board and people get confused because they haven't gone through orientation. They don't understand how we get things done at boards. The issue of the fact that committees make recommendations, not decisions, can be misunderstood by some committee members. So I more often see hurt feelings and broken relationships when we have folks appointed to our boards committees, but I see a healthy relationship when they're invited in as an advisor on a particular topic a committee might be working on.
All right, we're going to move on to projects. So, in what phase of a construction project should a project manager be hired? I'm just going to look at Jerry.
In the beginning. I believe I'm going by the list of questions. You caught me out of order there. The project manager, again, let's talk about defining what a project manager is. There's a lot of different terms that are used. It used to be called the clerk of the works, project manager, owner's representative, construction manager, et cetera, et cetera. In very large projects, there's very defined roles for them. But what you're looking for is an owner's representative who understands the construction process and will help you take a look at the architectural drawings. They'll help to look at the bid documents, and they, along with the architect, will provide quality control during the construction process. They'll make sure that people show up. They'll keep a log. They will have comments, and they will be, usually they will run the construction meetings. And so it's important to bring them in earlier, the better. And I worked with a gentleman who did this in Manhattan in very large projects, and he used to meet with some of our classes, and he said, we save you money the earlier we get into a project. If the plans are already made, we're just commenting on something that's already done. If it's already bid, it's too late. All we're going to do is be a clerk of the works then. So earlier the better. There's another question that I think you take the one from the architect? The architects will say, oh, we'll do this for you. This is personal from a lot of experience. I believe there should be a dynamic tension among the team that everybody's got a role to play, and they have to learn to play nicely. And in the case, if an architect does recommend a construction manager, absolutely due diligence, but don't just take what they give you. If you have done your homework and you've talked to other organizations, other libraries, you can call other libraries up, no matter where they are, even outside of New York State, to say, how did this work out? Due diligence in that regard. There are some very good construction management firms, owners reps, that can help you with your project, but they need a fresh pair of eyes. And if they are beholden to the architect, I think you need to take that into consideration. So I think use your good judgment, due diligence in that regard. earlier the better. You should get your construction manager, owner's rep involved in the project, and they work for you. They don't work for the architect.
So this next question, Jerry, it sounds like you may have answered the first part of it, because you're talking about having a specialized project manager, bringing him in early and understanding. But one library asked, can a board member or a library director serve as project manager? And if not, what's a better role for them to play?
I don't think that's appropriate. And I'll tell you, well, first of all, not a board member. I don't, if they have that much experience, they should resign from the board and offer their services as a professional. I was actually called to in a situation, in a system where the board president served as a project manager and was paid for it. Illegal. He might have had the experience, but that was illegal. So no, don't do that. You can. I actually working with a board now that has if they have an architect on the board, and he understands his role perfectly. He sits back. I'm not a library architect. I'll ask questions as a colleague, but I'm not going to interfere with that. Insofar as the director, no. I have seen directors do that too. I think they were better library directors than they were project managers. Are you going to pay them extra? Get a professional. Would you hire a contractor to run your library? Why would you hire your librarian to run a construction job? So I don't think that that's appropriate. I do believe you should put together a team. And yes, it will cost you money. That will save you a lot in the long run.
I will mention here, though, that both the board and the director, particularly when you're entering into, a multi-million-dollar capital project, you have to be mindful of the fact that your director is a project manager in some capacity for the time that project's in place. And so, no, I agree with Jerry that they should not be the project manager. You should have a project manager do it, but be mindful of the fact that you need to plan for that. So the things that your director typically does on an everyday basis during a capital project are going to be different. And so, working with staff. So if you have an assistant director, maybe that assistant director can take on some of those duties the director would normally do in that year, because, it's a 12 to 18 month, sometimes 24-month long project. And every day you're going to have to pivot. I mean, we always have to do that in the work that we do, but it's always going to have to be pivoting for that construction project. And so just making sure you're available for your project manager to answer questions, making sure that you're educating yourself through your project manager and your architects and your engineers, being available to them. So because things can happen very quickly. And if you're not available to answer those questions, while they shouldn't be going ahead and making those decisions without your input, at the same exact time, it doesn't open up the opportunity for mistakes. So just knowing that as a director, from a project management standpoint, not as a project manager, you got to be available during those capital project moments.
So let's get into this. Thank you very much, Brian, for bringing me back to where we should be. Let's get into definitions. There are terms, project manager, and I believe Ron has a certificate in project management. There's a construction manager, and I have a certificate in construction management. And the truth of the matter is, and I'm going to defer again to what Brian just said, your library director is a project manager overall. They've managed the vote. They've helped to coordinate who's the financer. They coordinate. If you have a renovation project, they're the ones that are going to help move the furniture around. Now, they might get advice from everyone else about how to do that, but maybe for our purposes, and I would be the first to do this, the library director manages the overall project. What you want is a construction manager who's going to deal with the contractors and the architect, bringing their expertise in. And they'll also work, of course, with the director. And if you have a board liaison, they'll keep them involved. Does that tie in a little bit better, Ryan, with the point you're making? Yeah. Thank you very much. I think maybe we should change our language going forward. Just construction managers, and I think they have. There's a lot of differentiation between types of construction management that I think we'll get to in a later question. So I'll be quiet now.
All right. I like this next question because it incorporates the expertise of both Ron and Jerry. In starting a building plan, how best to involve the community, staff, and board?
Start with a strategic plan. Right,
That's
Ron?
what that's what I was going to say
Right.
too. All part of your strategic plan. What are the plans
Yeah.
for your library? Building is a big part of that.
Yeah, we were asked too for samples of building programs, and the biggest part of the building program you've already articulated, hopefully in your strategic plan, about the community, about your values, about the mission, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It sets the stage for that. So I think it's critical that when you did the strategic planning, there was some community involvement. And when you get into, if the strategic plan or calls for a building program, and if it doesn't, maybe it's time to go back and review your strategic plan, then you've already started community involvement. And I do believe that there's a role for the community in it. But when it comes to the needs of the library, that's a balance. That's what you have a professional staff for. That's what you have the trustees for. But it's the community you're serving. So you need to be able to take their wants and turn it into a plan. And so we're all a partnership in that. But, and there's a process whereby sometimes you bring a community together to actually plan the architecture of the building. And some architects like to do that. They're gonna plan the building in one day. That's fun. And then they come out with their little models and whatnot. But that's not generally used that much these days, especially in libraries on occasion. So it's what you feel with your community. Ron, I think you could elaborate a little bit more on that, I guess, with the planning process, especially.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things, so one of the New York State minimum standards for libraries is to have a building that meets your community's needs. So there's already like a set justification to say, like, we have to do this anyway, so you might as well do a really great job. And as you're asking people about what they believe the library should become, or what they like or dislike or anything like that, a lot of it relates back to what's our physical building look like, and how's it going to best serve our community. And there's a lot of justification there to plan, to fund, to build, and to make a really great organization, and getting that community input, as well as staff, because they're the ones that are actually going to be executing the various things within your building. So what are their perspectives on it? And then what would the board like to see? So
Yeah.
I think it all ties together really well. And having kind of a bird's eye view of this is what we need to do, this is what we'd love to do, and here's how we're going to do it, I think is a really good piece of planning, as well as project management, building management, when it comes to making sure that you are creating the best resource that you can.
I'm
Yeah,
gonna
and I
jump in on
think
this one. I know I wasn't invited to, but I'm doing it anyway, guys.
Do it.
But one of the things I've learned along the way is this idea of levels of work. That, the question is asking, when you're starting that building plan, you need to have really clear guiding principles for that building plan that you do have consensus on with your board, staff, and community. So taking what you learned from the strategic planning process, but marrying that with the practical knowledge that your staff has of that building, that we all agree one of our guiding principles has to be 100% accessibility for everyone in this community. Now, getting down to the nitty-gritty of the design of an accessible facility, that's going to come in a different part. So the level of input you're receiving at the start of your building program process is going to be a little different than it's going to be when perhaps you have an architect on board and you're doing design charrettes around how it's actually going to work, or how we're actually going to make it possible. But that guiding principles line, aligning people's expectations and what we all understand to be the goals, that's where I find the strongest projects are born out of.
This actually goes back to a question that we got when we did this program. Should the director, what is the director's role in this? And I'm going to go back to what Brian said. If the director's a project manager, they begin managing this when it's just a dream. And that means they need to, one of the questions was, should the director write the building program if there's a statement? And my answer was yes, that's part of their job. And it's bringing these pieces together of the philosophy and mission of the library, the needs of the community, the limitations you currently have, the strategic plan with the vision of where you're going. That's that's actually one of the most exciting things a library director can do in their entire career. And yes, it's a lot of work. But
So the next question we have, which I have no idea how to answer this one, so I'll be really interested to hear perspectives on this one because I think it's kind of it's a tough one. But what factors should you use to determine whether you should fully renovate an existing structure or build a completely new facility?
well, it's what's practical. I mean, you know, if you're not sure, then you need to do a cost benefit analysis of the whole thing. Is your site good enough to stay? Now, again, your existing library, it might be an historic building, and if you wanted to move it, you wouldn't be able to because the community would be up in arms. There's just so many variables in this, Ron. I agree with you. It's a tough one to answer, but it's what have you got to work with? Are you going to put 10 pounds in a 5-pound bag just because you don't want to move? Or do you want to seriously look at other sites to build a library or to move into a library? And I think it's something that a board has to evaluate. And sometimes it takes quite a while. Last year or so, I worked with a library that desperately in need of space. And there was an offer from a developer who had bought a shopping mall and they wanted the library to be the anchor there. And it was very attractive. The city wanted it, you know, it looked good for all around, but the library did diligence. And they came to the conclusion that no, it's not the right thing for us to do, even though it might be very popular with our city and the developer is, you know, I guess, do we trust the developer or not? That was a question as well, but they did diligence and they looked at the possibility and they got very close to it, but then they realized, no, we should really try to buy some property right next to us and keep the library where it belongs downtown. And that was their decision, and they're moving forward to that now. It was a perfect example of really doing diligence about what's the right thing, not just for this library, but for the community the library serves. So that's, I think, the best I can do in that thing. Do your homework. That's all. There's no magic bullet. It's just making a decision of what's right for you.
I think it goes back to that idea of guiding principles too. Like if you're all in agreement, our job is to create the most accessible facility possible that respects natural resources and creates a healthy and educational environment. And then you do your engineering study, you do a walkability study of, okay, if we're going to be accessible, can people walk to it? Are we a community anchor? Are we part of Main Street? You know, I worked on a project once where we had a board that was super excited about the opportunity to build a brand new building, leave this Carnegie style building that was kind of wedged into the village, that no parking, and it was a beast to maintain because it was an older building. And what if we just built a brand new building out near the town recreation park? Wouldn't that be amazing? And like they became their own kind of bubble of talking about that and getting excited about it. And when they put it out there, the community heard, they're like, are you kidding me? You would leave the village? You would take that energy out of the center of the village and throw it out into this field? That reaction of what people really wanted, the atmosphere they're looking for, the fabric of the community and the role the library plays in that needed to be factored in. So I think it's a complicated discussion, but there's a dashboard of options to be thinking and assessing there. You know, sometimes we do engineering reports on historic buildings and we realize, you know what, we are not in the historic preservation business. We're in the library business. And sometimes you have to make that tough call to leave that historic building and go someplace else or build something newer. But I think there's no one size fits all answer, as Jerry said.
So that brings us to our final question, and it also ties into what we've just been talking about. So how funding the library or the new building or the renovated building, is it possible to use tax levy funds to fund a capital project for an association library?
Sure. Absolutely. And that should be the primary place that you go to do a public library, even though you're an association library. And it depends on how you have your vote set up. Do you publicly vote on your budget? If you vote 259 or a 414, then you already have a mechanism whereby you can increase your budget to meet the mortgage payment that you'd have to pay off the capital construction loan. And you'll get a loan either through the dormitory authority or through a civic development corporation or from a bank. But you absolutely can use the cash flow, the revenue stream that is given to you when the community votes yes on increasing your budget by an amount necessary to meet those mortgage payments. It's absolutely. And if you want help on how to get to public voting, you can look at the Library District toolkit on the DLD site, right, Rebecca? I think you can
Right.
find that.
I think that's it. We don't have any more questions, do we, Ron?
That's it. Another after party successfully completed.
And here's the even better part. We're literally 1 hour and 30 minutes in. Actually, 1 hour and 29 minutes in. So we are
We planned it that way, right?
we plan it that way on par with any other trustee handbook book club. So I think that's fantastic. Well, thanks, guys. Like Ron says, I always learn every time I'm in the room with you, and I learned a lot here today. And I hope everybody that watches this session also learned a lot. We want to thank everyone for viewing this installment of the Trustee Handbook Book Club After Party Part 3. So this is our third time doing it. We really enjoyed answering the questions and discussing the questions that have been submitted all over 2023. The exciting part is now we are in 2024. So we hope you will join us for live 2024 versions of the book club. Upcoming discussions will take place on March 19th. June 18th and October 15th. Those are all Tuesdays like they've always been, and they all begin at 5:00 p.m. You can register for these events on the Mid-Hudson Library System's website. So that's www.midhudson.org/trustee book club. You'll also find any of our previous recordings and sessions at this location. So don't miss next March's session. This is absolutely going to be a great one. It focuses on what's new in the 2023 edition of the Trustee Handbook. This is one you don't want to miss. We're so excited to have this recent post-pandemic version of the handbook, and we know it will have even more insights than past editions because it was written by two amazing colleagues of ours, Rebecca Smith-Aldrich and Jerry Nichols. Thanks everybody for joining us throughout the New York State Library community and beyond here today. We can't thank you enough for doing the work that you do, and we look forward to continuing down this path of public librarianship with all of you. Thanks everyone. Take care and be well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.